The violent anti-ICE protests that swept Los Angeles and other parts of the nation were not only destructive and a good example of just how far some rogue political elements in the nation are willing to go to express their point, they were also entirely predictable to anyone who had studied the mobocratic currents that are currently moving through our modern age. But not only were they predictable, but they were a sign of a broader episode we are currently in as a nation and civilization of civic decay. And they are a clear reason as to why we as Americans must enter into a period of civic revivalism, which is not merely about teaching American history. It's not merely about putting your hand over your heart while you sing the national anthem. It is instead discovering the moral dimensions and character of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen, and how to assert those things in the modern age. So in this video, my friends, we're going to show just why civic revivalism is what we need. Not despair, not nihilism, not doomerism, as the kids say these days, but civic revivalism. And I'm going to explain exactly how this is going to be able to rescue us from the period we're in right now. But before we get that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message is successful. My friends, we are approaching 20,000 subscribers. I believe that we are part of a movement, a nascent movement, but a movement nonetheless, that is going to reassert the moral foundations of our founding in this country into the public discourse, and that is going to heighten the level of thinking that Americans have should more folks hear our message. This is a civic conservative project rooted strongly in philosophy, rooted strongly in a desire to learn, and most importantly, rooted strongly in love of countrymen. So if this is something that you want to be a part of, then again, like, share, comment, subscribe. My friends, thank you so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, the LA riots, the LA ICE riots, have resulted in millions of dollars of damages, many small businesses in Los Angeles being vandalized by activists who are responding in indignation to the massive deportations that ICE has undertaken over the past few weeks, as of the posting of this video. And this has led to Marines and the National Guard, thousands of National Guard and hundreds of Marines being deployed to protect federal buildings. It has led to, we've seen scenes of cops getting bikes thrown upon their cars and getting hit with cinder blocks. We've seen also scenes of just cars on fire and people waving the flag of a foreign country as they protest the policy of the country they are in. And there have been a lot of chatter about this particular episode. But unless we understand the historic and philosophic roots of what we are seeing, it'll simply be empty chatter. So this analysis will be in two parts. First, we must understand mobocracy, which sounds like a very funny word, but I will explain it in a second. We must understand its historical dimensions, we must understand its character, and we must understand particularly how it manifests within our society and why it is particularly dangerous. But then we must also understand why the civic revivalism is the antidote to mobocracy, and how exactly that can stop future events like this from happening by predating them and preemptively fixing the premises that bring them about. So, I actually predicted the rise of these kinds of riots a few months ago, as opposed to this video, 6 months ago, in a video titled the Coming Age of Mobocracy, a Warning to America, the Coming Mobocratic Age, a Warning to America. And I had been seeing, before Donald Trump was sworn into office, like I posted this on January 1st, which was a few weeks before he was sworn into office formally, I had been seeing left-wing organizing calls, calling for mass resistance, and urging people to organize in their local communities towards that particular very interesting end. And those calls had many thousands, upwards of 50,000 people live. And it also had the participation of Democratic Congresspeople like Jamie Raskin and Jayapal and others who were actively encouraging this sort of mass resistance. Now, there's one thing to encourage a form of protest being a benevolent form of expression of one's beliefs towards the system they currently exist in, which is totally fine, it's totally a moral act. But when it comes to the word resistance, that is not merely protest. Now you have moved from protest, which has a clear moral dimension, to a more active, a more conflict-oriented dimension, where now things become a little bit more sketchy, so to speak. And so I had predicted that as certain policies become rolled out within the Trump administration, there will not be reasoned debate and calm and cool approaches to the issues of the day. There will instead be impassioned mobs sicked upon the nation, sicked upon certain areas of the country to change and affect the outcomes of governance, which leads us to the idea of mobocracy. Mobocracy, and I'll be very brief because I encourage all of you to go watch the Coming Age of Mobocracy video. I went through the entire concept, and it's very important for you to watch it. So I'll be very brief here in lieu of that video. Mobocracy can simply be defined not really as mob rule, which is a rather, I think, undefined phenomenon, but as a group of people riled up by passion who seek to use their coercive influence to effect the mechanisms of government. Mobocracy has three primary forms. Number one, institutional mobocracy. Institutional democracy is when people within institutions, like politicians or community leaders, actively encourage the development of raw passions to form into mobs that will eventually effect the mechanisms of government. This is exactly what people like Raskin and Jayapal were doing on those particular calls. Then you have anarchic mobocracy. Anarchic mobocracy is simply the raw, unfiltered, aggregate form of that rage directed towards a particular situation. So what we saw in 2020 with the sort of Summer of Love was exactly an example of anarchic mobocracy. What we're seeing right now in Los Angeles and across the nation is a mixture of institutional and anarchic mobocracy. And the third form is digital mobocracy. Digital mobocracy is simply what I mentioned a moment ago, an attempt to coercively influence the outcomes of governance through the digital form, through mobs that dox and shame people and go into their replies and give an illusion that there are more folks opposed to what they are saying than they actually are, and also engage in coordinated harassment campaigns. A lot of people in these digital mobs are not people, they are bots, but it is still a very important phenomenon when it comes to the influence of political discourse in this country. Now, there have been two primary instances of mobocracy that I think are historically significant within American history. First is what Lincoln was responding to in his Lyceum address in the 1840s, when mobs in his area, like literally lynch mobs, were going about and expressing their dissatisfaction with people they didn't like by killing them. And he called this the coming of the mobocratic spirit. And his entire idea was that when people act outside of institutions, they are therefore acting as a mob, and they are therefore destructive to society. Then you have what Joseph Smith and the early Mormons in the 19th century as well went through, where they were being kidnapped and kicked out of states because people didn't like their particular beliefs. They were being shunned as heretics, and mobs were the vehicle by which these things were orchestrated. So mobocracy has a cemented and a very strong place in this country. And by understanding this, we can understand how it is connected to our current moral-civic crisis. So with the rise of mobocracy comes particularly the demise of the moral imagination. The moral imagination is the first stage in how we as citizens, and we as more than just citizens, moral agents, understand how duty and obligation towards others and how conscience form a union together to conspire our behavior towards right conduct. In the absence of duty or obligation, in the absence of conscience, in the absence of what Grotius termed right reason, which is to conform our actions with a moral standard of reason, not simply rational, but rational plus moral. In the absence of all these things, ruination is the result. Society utterly craters. And when you see mobocracy occur in Los Angeles, when you see it occur in Portland, Oregon, wherever it is, where people think the acceptable form of protesting what they disagree with is violence, coercion, intimidation, you are seeing the collapse of the moral imagination. And if this is to be extended as a standard beyond one single instance, you will ultimately see the ruination of society and the ruination of the moral sense within people. This is why civic revivalism is needed, and this is especially why it is needed in America, because America rests upon a moral proposition, not merely a proposition of soil or blood or lineage or tribal conflict, which then therefore means anything that corrodes the moral education of a people in a country based upon a moral proposition is existential to that country, more so than it would be if it corroded the moral understanding of a people in a country based upon something else. It would still be dangerous, obviously, but its danger manifests in a very different form. Mobocracy is not merely a mode of engagement, but it also has its own kind of moral character. And the moral character of mobocracy is might makes right. Whoever is the loudest, and therefore whoever is the strongest, and whoever whip up the biggest frenzy as possible, can then therefore drive change for inherently benevolent goals. This is the kind of faux benevolence behind mobocracy. You may see, for example, in the anti-ICE protests, people saying that people who are in the country illegally are being kidnapped and disappeared off to vast corridors, and they are being assaulted, and this assault is authoritarian and it is tyrannical. Well, faux benevolence, the thing about benevolence in general is that benevolence is inherently an expression of sentiment, and sentiment gives us a good, well-warmed feeling towards our fellow man. It is in some ways can be an enhancer of social relationships. But in other ways, if benevolence is the sole standard by which we conduct ourselves, it becomes detrimental towards duty. Because if someone has come into your country, they are here illegally, they are not following the laws, they are therefore not only not abiding by the rules that all guests have to abide by, they are also being deceitful. And they are also lacking fidelity, and to lack fidelity in a country that is letting you come in as a guest is most certainly a moral wrong, and therefore they are violating their duty that they have towards the country. And as a citizen, if you defend that by destroying your country, you are also violating your moral duty. When benevolence becomes more than duty, moral behavior becomes impossible, because moral behavior cannot be decided by outcomes solely. Moral behavior must be decided first by first principles, and our duties come from our sense of first principles. This is why civic revivalism is needed, because it reignites the moral imagination, it rediscovers the importance of duty and obligation in social relationships, and it follows the consequences of both of these discoveries through a uniquely Americanist lens. Now, I mentioned that the riots are inspired by a sort of might makes right idea, but they're also inspired by an abstract notion of the immigrant that becomes actionable through whipping up frenzy. And whenever a person is inspired by an abstract idea that is a stand-in for a more complex issue, that person fails to recognize the concreteness of moral relationships, and they open themselves up to become tyrannized by both their passions and their appetite. This is a point that Lord Keynes made very brilliantly, one of my favorite philosophers made very brilliantly. He says, for example, that it may be observed in the next place, the rude and illiterate are governed by their appetites and their passions more than by general principles. It is by education and practice that we acquire a facility in forming complex ideas and abstract propositions. The ideas of a common interest, of a country, of a people, of a society under government, of public good, are complex and not soon acquired even by the thinking part of mankind. Remove those principles of action which, being directed towards general and complex objects, are conducted by reflection. The force of the appetites and passions which act by blind impulse will, of course, be doubled. He's saying that when we do not reflect and think deeply about the things that we are directing our attention towards, we become a victim to our own limitations, a victim to our own emotions, and we become little better than brutes led by blind impulse. He says, quote, "This is precisely the condition of those who, abandoning the authority of reason, surrender themselves to every appetite. They are tyrannized by passion and have no consistent rule of conduct. Their defect rather lies in the weakness of their general principles of action. This defect is remedied by education and reflection, and then it is that the moral sense, in concert with the general principles, acquires its full authority, which is openly recognized and cheerfully submitted to." Keynes is saying that if we do not only reflect, but also understand the objects that our attention and our energies are directed towards, and understand them within their proper context, especially as they relate to moral and social relationships, we become a danger to ourselves and everyone around us, because we become tyrannized by passion. Mobocracy is essentially a justification that for those that are tyrannized by passion, which then directs their passions and their appetites towards a cause that seems benevolent by having this sort of group hive mind mentality on full display as the mobocratic regime plays out. This is precisely what happened in the LA riots. And this also ignores the importance of what is called sociability. Now, Grotius, another philosopher as well, many of you not heard of, but who also inspired John Locke and who had an immense impact on the American founders. Grotius essentially had this idea of sociability. Sociability says we all desire, by virtue of being human, peaceful and mutual coexistence with other people in society. But in order to achieve that, certain principles have to be in effect. One of those principles has to be a mutual respect of what we own. Well, we own ourselves, but we also own property. And so Grotius finds sociability on the basis of self-ownership and on the basis of property as well. And then he defines it further by emphasizing the importance of being just in your behavior, i.e. the principle of justice, towards others. So you can't have sociability without first having moral standards and moral rules. However, when it comes to how these riots have been handled, when it comes to mobocracy, they deny and reject the sort of moral rules that give rise to civic health and moral duty by putting aside our social impulse to cooperate and instead dividing society into a cacophony of warring parties that can be understood solely by their positioning in a certain issue and not by everything else that makes society and makes human beings interesting and also gives a sort of formation to our thoughts and our patterns. And so this moral crisis, my friends, is compounded by the fact that without moral knowledge, there's going to be very little wise political decisions made because politics is merely applied ethics. And when we consider the issue of immigration, civic revivalism becomes ever more important because immigration directly includes and concerns membership within a society, however tenuous that might be. And John Locke made the very important point in the Second Treatise that when foreigners come into a country, not only are they bound by the rules, but they're also bound by the goodwill of the Commonwealth. And the moment that those foreigners do not follow those rules is the moment that their presence in the country becomes a threat to the Commonwealth. But not only that, but a foreigner cannot be considered a full member of the society until and if that foreigner decides to adopt the ways of the people in the Commonwealth, adopt their values, and become fully integrated into the society. Well, when someone is here illegally, when someone is not willing to display a due respect for our laws, when someone is not willing to assimilate, when all these things are happening, then and the immediate reaction of the citizen, immediate reaction of some people is to go ahead and support them as if they are some aggrieved victim for simply getting what they are due. That is when we see another example of some faux benevolence being held over civic duty, as some faux benevolence being held over the relationships that actually form a society. The people that are protesting, those who are here illegally, getting either removed or getting their status reassessed, are people who don't have a very strong view or a very strong understanding of the importance the relationships that social relationships bring to the idea of civic health. There are certain ways that these things have to be understood and done if we are to particularly have a functioning civil society. So, how do we resolve this moral civic problem where duty is subordinated to faux benevolence, where might makes right ignores all moral rules, and where our sense of compassion, our appetites tyrannize us, move us against sociability and towards the state of a perpetual combatant in a war in our own mind? Well, what we do is very simple, my friends. We have to recognize the context in which these debates happen. Outside the parameters of anyone's narrow ideology, we must embrace a sense of realism. And we also must embrace a strong moral education. We must place our duties both as citizens and moral agents over desire and over passion, and we must embrace the principle of charitability, which recognizes our inherent limits and says, my neighbor could be right even if I initially disagree with how my neighbor words his arguments or how my neighbor understands particular issues. By doing these things, we don't solve all disagreements automatically. So long as there are human beings that are limited and have their own perspectives, there shall be disagreement. But we adjust the plane upon which disagreement takes place, and we lower the temperature from being that of violence and corrosion to that of debate and perhaps even civic building. Civic revivalism does not resolve all of our problems, my friends, but it reignites the moral imagination. It regulates behavior in a manner which wades off social chaos, and it allows all of us citizens to reach a rational conclusion on complex issues. My friends, this is the era of civic revivalism. Join me for it. Be a part of it. If you are tired of not just the needless division, but of the factionalism that has beset American politics, and you are tired of the surface level, nonsensical takes that exist on all sides, and you want something deeper, then my friends, come on and join me in my journey to fight to restore a sense of civic revivalism in this country. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. Join my Discord if you can. Donate to me if you would like to. All the information for that is in the comment section down below. It really helps me continue to bring these videos to you. My friends, study history, study philosophy. Remember, one convict and please stay offensive.